Welcome to another episode of the Gay Barchives Show, where we explore gay history one bar at a time. Today, we're going to take a look at one of the most prolific and longest lasting gay bar empires to have ever existed. Started by Frank Caven more than 50 years ago, this organization has owned over 60 gay bars, and I guarantee you'll remember some of them. Tonight, Michael Caven will be joining us from Vietnam. Welcome to the show, Michael.
Hello, everybody. How are you doing? Hello, Art. Hello, Dallas, Texas, and the United States. I am Michael Caven.
Michael, I'm really excited to hear this story because I have long been a fan of the whole mystique of the Caven Enterprise operation. The gay bar scene has always been kind of interesting and very much an owner operator type of business for the most part. In most cities, the bars were owned by an individual who was on premises most of the time. And it was a very, maybe they own one or two bars. It was kind of unusual to have multiple locations. And you, at an early age, connected with Frank Caven, who I believe started in the late 60s, early 70s with his bar empire and grew it to unforeseen levels. It was amazing. But tell me a little bit first about who you were back in the early 80s and how you got into the Caven family.
Sure. Well, thank you so much. And again, Art, thank you for having me, and everybody who's watching. Thanks for being interested in this story. My journey with gay bars began on Long Island back in the very, very early 80s. The first gay bar I went to was the New Lining in Forest Hills, Queens, New York. And the bouncer, Scotty, very big guy. He was a great kisser. He loved to kiss you when you came in. And I found the whole setting to be a very freeing experience, kind of an oasis of safety. I'd been bullied in high school. I played lacrosse for my high school on Long Island. My parents were doing the best they could to bulldoze the homo out of me. And at the New Lining, I found an oasis where I could be myself. I could see same-sex dancing, and it was a revelation. Soon thereafter, I made it into New York City and would go to my first gay restaurant, Ties, on Christopher Street, which again was revelatory to see same-sex partners of all ages, sizes, and makes and models. And again, it was for this kid from Long Island, it was just an eye-opening experience. When I was younger, I was sexualized at a young age by family caregivers, as well as a teacher in high school. And I just mentioned that because early on, I got the message that my worth was as a sexual object. And that's how I saw myself, and that's where I got my validation. Soon thereafter, after being on Christopher Street and seeing all that, I discovered the Upper East Side of Manhattan and the bars there that catered to older gentlemen, and actually catered to younger gentlemen like me and their older admirers. And I discovered a place called Rounds, and I found that I got a lot of attention. Men would take me to dinners, older gentlemen would take me to dinners, buy me clothes, and do nice things for me and just show me a lot of attention. And I loved the attention. I sashayed around, and I loved showing off. And look, I wasn't a supermodel, but I was easy on the eyes for sure. And so I enjoyed the rounds. I went to the townhouse, and I worked the streets. I was high end. If you had drugs, if you had alcohol, if you were going to take me out, I was your friend. And that's just how I operated. That's how I rolled back then. But things began to go downhill. I left my home on Long Island and I moved to Florida. And I had a couple of jobs, but I was having a hard time making it. I was totally unprepared for life and the realities of life and what it is to be a young adult and pay bills and have responsibilities. I didn't know anything about that. And so I one night I was in Tampa and Sarasota. My Lord, Sarasota. I met my biological father for the first time. I didn't know him all my life, and he was married to a strip club owner named Mary, and they had the Club Mary. And I bring this up because I got to tell you, their showgirls, a lot of them were transgender, and it was like RuPaul's hardcore main stage at the Club Mary. And I digress. I'm sorry. So anyway, but after Sarasota, my dad and I really didn't have much in common except for alcohol. I moved to Tampa, and I really was just destitute. I was living on people's couches and roaming, and I wound up at the old plantation on Kennedy Boulevard on July 4th, 1983, Independence Day, and my life changed. I sat down at the bar. I only had $20 to my name, and I look over, and there's this larger man. He kind of reminded me of my grandfather. I don't know if that's a good or bad thing. And he had Buddy Holly glasses on, big smile on his face, cigar, and we looked at each other and we smiled, and we took it from there. And he could tell that I was young and hungry. I was unkempt, but still with a big smile on my face. And we wound up getting completely plastered. And I learned more about him. His name is Frank Caven, was Frank Caven. And I didn't know Frank. And he did not own the old plantation at that time. He had sold it to Bob Fournier. And as we get into Frank's history and bars, he would build bars and sell them almost as fast as he could build them. Because this was before computers. And if you've got all these cash businesses, how in the world can you be in 5 or 10 places at once? You can't. And so many of his managers were stealing from him. But anyway, so Frank and I, his nickname for the bed was the workbench. So, baby, I got to work, and we had what each other wanted. I brought him youth and vitality and personality, and I was quite a piece of work. And Frank brought me financial security, which is what I really wanted. And also, as I learned more about Frank, and he told me about his organization in Texas, where he had lots of businesses, it whet my appetite for what is this man all about. And I'd learned pretty quickly. And long story short, within a week, I had moved to Dallas. I had gone from being destitute and homeless to living in a penthouse in the sky like a pampered poodle. And I learned that Frank was a very big deal. And he was very, very successful, very wealthy, lots of cash, lots of cash. And one of the first things he did was he gave me D Magazine. D Magazine is the monthly magazine in Dallas. And back in 79, now this was 1983 that I met Frank, but in 79, they did a story on Frank and his then business partner, Charlie Hott. And I learned all about his very interesting life, and that he certainly wasn't born wealthy. And Frank's early career was selling used cars in Atlantic City, Philadelphia, New York, and he was in that business for a long time. And let me tell you, back then, used cars, it always had a shady reputation for good reason. There was a lot of shade going on, and I think he learned some hard lessons there, because by the time I came into the picture, he paid his taxes. He said, I sleep at night. I don't have to worry about anything about that, about the IRS. He was paranoid about the IRS. And so I read this article and I learned about his background, and that he used to have a car dealership near a military base. and he would entertain GIs at his apartment. And in 1969, a GI approached Frank, and he was a successful used car salesman. They called him the King of Cash, Frank Caven, the King of Cash, and this GI wanted to open a bar, and I guess because Frank had residency, they could put him on the liquor license, and the GI provided the money. And Frank got his first taste of the bar business, or one of his earlier tastes of it, and he saw the cash. And Frank loved cash. He loved cash. He loved to smell cash. He loved to have cash in one hand and a cigar in the other, and then maybe in his third hand he would have that whiskey, that Canadian Club whiskey. So that's how he got his start, and he would eventually make it to Dallas, and he had a few bars under his belt, and he was living at the Melrose on Cedar Springs, which was an old Grand Hotel, and he was trying to figure out what his next moves were going to be. And he had opened a few bars. He was getting on his way, and he met a kid named Charlie Hott. Now, I'm not sure if Charlie was a number one. Frank's expression for you, if you were his boyfriend and you were his main boyfriend, is you're number one. So I don't know about that with Charlie, but Charlie had what Frank didn't have, which was an eye for numbers. And he was Frank's eyes and ears on the ground. Whereas Frank could be visionary, and Frank loved opening bars outside of Texas, Charlie liked to focus on the Texas bars that they owned together. And they were a great, great team, and they complemented each other. And so it was a really important partnership. And when I read that article, I was like, wow, I get the idea. And I met Charlie. But by the time I got there, well, Charlie had access to a lot of cash, and and it was a lot for a young man his age. And I think that he basically had to get out of the business. So he found Jesus, and he went under the wing of William Criswell, who was the head of the Southern Baptist Church, the Reverend in Dallas. And he found Jesus, and he got out of the business. He says that he sold out to Frank for pennies on the dollar. That's how bad he wanted out of the business. I don't know about that, but I know that it broke Frank's heart. I know it broke Frank's heart, and because Frank really depended upon Charlie.
So before we get too much further into the story, for people who are not familiar with Frank Caven and don't know who he was or who he is, what his company and he himself created, he was kind of an innovator in the gay bar business. Not only was he not attached to his gay bars, where if for some reason somebody made him an offer that he couldn't refuse, he didn't refuse it. He wasn't too proud to say, okay, you can buy it, I'll do it again, I'll do it a different one, I'll do it better. And he was also one of the people that, there are very few of these in the gay bar industry, but he created legendary bars not only in Dallas, but for example, the Old Plantation, Dallas, El Paso, Houston, Jacksonville, Key West, Tampa. They were not just in one location, and every single one of them was famous. Same thing with JR's. JR's was another chain that there was Dallas, Houston, Tampa, and DC. So he was willing to try out new markets and do new things and innovate, and created a whole type of energy that really hadn't been seen before in the gay bar industry. And if I'm not mistaken, as you mentioned, Cedar Springs, he basically built the gayborhood. If it weren't for Frank Caven and his numerous bars that he put in that neighborhood, that
Oakland.
wouldn't be
Mm-hmm.
the gay neighborhood. and there's
That's
still
right.
five. They still have five businesses there.
They do.
So
Caven Enterprises is still in business. JR's is still there. Other of his staple
Sue
restaurant,
Ellen,
Sue
the
Ellen's,
the mining
uh,
company.
the mining company,
Um,
and there's no old plantation, but now I think it is called
S4.
TR2 S4. That's
It
right.
used
That's
to be
right.
called Village Station,
That's right.
and then they remodeled and expanded, and they opened up as Station 4, which has been
Right.
abbreviated to S4 because it was the fourth
Hmm.
incarnation
That's
of that
right.
brand.
That's
Um,
right.
and they just opened a kind of restaurant bar called Panda Corn Cafe.
Yes, they've expanded into the Chinese
So,
food business, which makes sense because that's where all their customers go at 2 o'clock in the morning is to get some
right.
Chinese food and work on that hangover you're going to have the next day. And yes, so I learned early on that there were players in this game. And I'm really glad that you mentioned his bars. Frank was a visionary and he had a sense and he had his ear to the ground as to what people wanted. Now you mentioned the gay area. It's called Oak Lawn in Dallas on Cedar Springs. His nickname for it was Homo Heights. he had nickname he had nicknames for everything. Let me tell you. He also had a bunch of bars down on Fitzhugh, including the frat house. He called that area Faggot Flats. So, again, Frank was not politically correct. And he's a product of his time. There was a bit of Archie Bunker there. But he loved his frat house. And that was one of the ways that he would find number ones they'd have wet jockey short contests. And Frank would be out there with his water bottle spraying all the contestants. And that's where he discovered Dennis Weir. So let's talk about the players in this Game of Thrones. We had Frank, of course, and then there's Charlie Hott. He found Jesus. He was out, but we did have connection. I mean, we did stay connected to Charlie. And in fact, I brokered a dinner for Charlie and Frank so that they could finally get together and have an official goodbye and say what they needed to say to each other. And I always had a soft spot for Charlie because I knew that Frank would not have gotten to the level that he got without Charlie. Frank would not have been the visionary. I mean, he really needed that foundation. So I always had a soft spot for Charlie. But when I arrived, there was Dennis Weir, who was Frank's previous number one, and Frank had discovered him at the frat house, and he was managing bars. Now, if you're in Frank's life, most of the young men in Frank's life were either interested in getting a bar or getting a car. And that's kind of how it rolled. And so so Dennis was on his way. He was a bar manager. He managed the frat house. He managed the old plantation on Cedar Springs. Another fellow, Charles Armstrong, he managed JR's, what was known as 4001, which was on the other side of the block of Throckmorton. And I remember 4001 specifically. And it was, again, Frank's vision. Of course, there's bars on the perimeter. So wherever you are, in any of Frank's clubs, you can get a drink in 30 fucking seconds. Okay. So, I mean, he was all about quality drinks, efficient service, and friendliness at the front door. Those were his three things. And he hated, he was always checking the ice machines to make sure they're clean. God help you if you were a manager and there was a light bulb that was out. You were in big fucking trouble. But of course, the bars are on the perimeter of this club 4001. Sylvester did a big show there once, and I got to meet Sylvester, and it was so packed. It was so packed with so many people that you couldn't even see Sylvester. That's how many people were there. And Frank had an expression, wall to wall bodies. Wall to wall bodies is money in the bank. And he loved wall-to-wall bodies. And at JR's, if you were driving down Throckmorton or up Cedar Springs during happy hour, you would just see the silhouette of heads bopping up and down, and just a wall of bodies. And why would you see them? Well, because of these great picture windows. Frank was, again, part of his innovation and part of his vision was out of the fucking shadows and into the world. So a number of his, certainly JRs for sure, had big windows so that patrons could see out, you could see in, no shame, we are who we are. And now, on the other hand, Throckmorton, which was behind JR's, no windows. Lots of
Well,
soft orange.
Throckmorton was more of a Levi Leather men's bar, and they typically, in any city, if you look at, for instance, the history of the Eagles and similar bars, they oftentimes were off the beaten track. They were not in the middle of the neighborhood. They were, in an industrial park, and by design, because those people didn't necessarily want to be seen. That might have been a realtor, a lawyer, a banker, and they don't want to be seen in a leather harness and chaps walking down the street to go into a bar with another man.
It
So
is true.
it's understandable that what was then called Throckmorton Mining Company, it's now TMC, the mining
TMC.
company, but it's still there. It's just moved. I think that location became Sue Ellen's.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, I didn't know that. Okay. I thought Sue Ellen's was more near Old Plantation, but it may have been, and then they moved it. Again, things have
Yeah.
changed a lot. And it's only been, 40 years since I was a part of the whole drama. But yes, the TMC, then known as the Throckmorton, they would not let you in if you were a preppy. No fucking way. If you had an Izod on your anything, I mean, jeans, t-shirt, leather. And yes, you're right. There were lots of businessmen, successful stockbrokers, attorneys, accountants, and they had two lives. They had their mainstream life in the day, and then at night they were either at JR's, which was colloquially known as an S&M bar, stand and model, or they were leather daddies at the Throckmorton Mining Company. And so there was a lot of dual lives going on. And Frank met that need because, for your viewers, please understand, we did not have the internet back then. We had weekly bar rags. They were known as bar rags. And what was the one? This Week in Texas, also
Twit.
known as Twit. That's right. And oh, I remember the fellow that ran that was such a sweet guy. Oh, I'll think of his name shortly. But yes, so we had bar rags, and Frank was a big advertiser. Frank believed if you're going to advertise, full page for your bar, not half page. He hated half pages. He thought they were a waste of money. And he'd get into rows with Twit and with other media and so on, and then they'd kiss and make up. And so there was no internet back then, people, and we had to make do with what we had. And at JR's, one of the ways that you could keep track of the people that you met, the men that you met, were through what are known as trick cards. So there were these small business card size cards, and he'd have a stack of them with the JR's logo or the TMC logo. He had them in all his bars. And with little bowling pencils, the little pencils you would have at the bowling alley, and a stack of those. And if you meet somebody and you like them, you write their name down, you write their phone number. And then I have a direct recollection, although recently on one of the groups, somebody did show some trick cards that at least on the back, there was a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 along the bottom. And you could circle. Is he a 10? Is he an 8? Is he a 7? Is he a 5? So you can remember, because again, there was so much sex going on, so many men, so little time, and everyone was very, very busy, very busy. New, better, and different was the motto. I'm a great lay. Let's go.
Well, and for Frank, what was particularly good about especially about that Oaklawn setup, is that at least for me, I was living in Atlanta at the time that you moved to Dallas. Um, I went out every night of the week. You know, you went to dinner, you went to hang, you know, then you went out to a bar because there was nowhere else to socialize. You didn't have social media, you didn't have cell phones, you didn't have any other way, you know, you weren't going to run into them randomly in the mall and hope to start up a conversation. So you went to the bar, and whether or not you went there to drink, you went there to socialize. And so, with having all his, not all, but a number of his bars collected in one place, if you didn't like what you saw at JR's, you could go down the street to another bar that he owned and give him money there. So he, you know,
Mhm.
was kind of,
Yes, he anticipated what the different crowds would want, depending on what your taste is and how you identify in your gay life and lesbian life. And through the old plantation, he was able to facilitate the careers of drag queens in the performance space and so on. So Frank, again, very visionary. He could see things. He could see what was going to be coming up the road. He loved trends. He loved reading the market, and he loved meeting people. He loved his fans. He loved his following. He loved his customers. He loved his managers. Um, and We'll get to it in a minute, but right now, Caven Enterprises is partially owned by the managers, and he would have loved that. He would have loved that. Now, not all of it, because I think that the current principal has a majority stake, but still, the fact is that they own the business, and that addresses the whole issue of theft. Because if you own the business, you're going to steal from yourself, and so we're back now, 1983. I'm in Dallas. My life has changed. When Frank and I walk into the bar, there's a parting of ways. And, I was the object of lots of gossip, and people would laugh at me and snicker. And when I'd walk in and throw their judgmental glances. And there were folks who were also very admiring. And as I began to get my bearings, I began to see that I was a player, and being by Frank's side. And but unlike the men in his life, the young men, I'm sorry, the young men in his life, I wasn't necessarily interested in a bar or a car. I wanted an education. So I enrolled at SMU, Southern Methodist University, also known as Send Money Urgently. and and started going to school. And he found that refreshing, that I wanted an education. And he was all for bettering yourself, however you felt you needed to better yourself. And I came from a very pro-education family life. So I was going to school. Frank was traveling. We took cruises. We went, took these amazing trips. I introduced him to limousines. Yeah, which outside of Dallas, he kind of enjoyed the luxury, but in Dallas, he was more modest. He just liked to be in his Cadillac with his big cigar. And Dennis and I, Dennis, who was his number one, we had quite a rivalry. We had a love-hate relationship, mostly hate, and we were like two chihuahuas, kiss, kiss, slap, 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 slap. And we went on. We'd have these big screaming matches, and it would upset people at the office, it was really impossible for us to collaborate or have a partnership because we did not trust each other. And I felt that he was always trying to get back into Frank's world and usurp me as number one. And you can imagine how stricken Dennis looked when he found out that Frank was going to adopt me as an adult. He was like, what? And Frank did adopt me as an adult in 1984. And the judge was real cute. There was all families there at the adoption court with their balloons and gifts and cakes. And there was Frank and I. So the judge says, yes, of course, I'll grant the adoption, but Mr. Michael, no need to sit on my lap. to the laughs of everybody in the courtroom. And and so Frank and I, we had a complicated relationship. I mean, of course, there was a lot of love and affection, but also it was challenging with our age difference. He was 60, I was 20, and because I wasn't focused totally on his bars, I wasn't becoming the typical heir like Dennis was positioning himself. And let me say that Dennis was in it to win it for sure. And I was young, naive, stupid, and a bit of a punk. Okay. And I was way over my head, way, way over my head. And I realize that now. And, you know, as much as Dennis and I hated each other, I've come to love Dennis, and I'm fond of Dennis these days. And I do acknowledge the impact that he had on the gay bar scene in Dallas after Frank's death. Long story short, Frank and I, well, uh, Frank was Frank was building bars. Frank was in Tampa rebuilding the El Goya again in Ybor City. And I was in Dallas, and I was messed up with some, inappropriate people doing inappropriate things, having big grand dinners. I was like a gay Tony Montana, real punk, and drinking and lots of everything. And so eventually I wound up in treatment. And at Raleigh Hills, Frank's nickname for Raleigh Hills was Rolling Hills. And he came to visit me when I was in treatment. And the counselor, who was from Mississippi, said, "You guys need to rethink your relationship. And Michael, you need to move out of the penthouse in the sky, move into the dorm at school, and you both need to have a father-son relationship, no benefits." And it was a lot for Frank and I to take in. And but he agreed, Frank agreed, and I agreed, and I did move into the dorm. Out went the Jaguar. I've got a more moderate, modest car to get around, and we changed our relationship. We stayed close. We had lunch or dinner at least once a week. One time he called me. Everyone loves this story, and he said, "Do you know Bernadette Peters?" And I said, "Well, of course I do. I'm gay." And he said, "Well, she's here at the JRs, and we're playing pool. You want to join us?" And I mean, I couldn't have gotten into my little rabbit convertible enough to get up to JRs and join Frank and Bernadette and her very hot, hot, hot boyfriend to play doubles, and lots of onlookers. And I don't remember who won. I think Bernadette's hot boyfriend won because he got a lot of attention. So Frank was also a Republican long before the term gay Republican ever became something. It's not that Frank was about Republican ideals. He just hated taxes. And he saw the Democrats as tax and spend liberals. And he did not like that. Remember, he was old school. And so we had some contacts in the local Republican Party. They suggested we become major donors. There was a program called the Eagles. Frank was an Eagle. I was a young Eagle. So his was 10,000 a year. Mine was 5,000 a year. And we went to the White House. He was drinking buddies with Jeannie Kirkpatrick. He'd sit at the bar and drink with her. They'd get drunk. And we met Ronald Reagan, Poppy Bush, all of those folks. We had 2 trips to the White House. And then the third one, Frank wasn't able to make it. So my mother from Long Island joined me, which the Republican Party liked because they assumed that she and Frank at one time were, they had me together. And so it served their narrative pretty well. But again, this was before the internet. Now, did the Republican Party, the National Republican Party, did they suspect that Frank was, I mean, I think they figured it out finally, but they were happy to take the money. And Frank was good with the crowd. He was good with the VIPs. He knew how to make small talk and talk about politics and stuff he'd like to talk about. And so here I am. In 1983, I was homeless and destitute. And now, 12 months later, I'm at the White House. I'm at the White House, which is really kind of remarkable when you think about it, how I could go from one extreme to the other. Pretty remarkable. He was friends with Phyllis Diller. He and Phyllis Diller liked each other. She'd come to the condo. They liked to drink together. Um, and she was a Republican as well. So we went to all of these Republican events. We bought a table at one of these big things, and we had mostly folks from the gay community at our table. And again, it was all very odd to the onlooker. But to us, we were fine with it. And this was before it got so toxic with Republicans and gays. And
I was going
maybe
to
it was a
say
more
that because
maybe it
because
was a more innocent time.
yeah, it
Yeah,
was. I remember. I'm a little bit older than you, but I remember things were different back in the 70s and 80s and even into the 90s. There wasn't so much animosity between Republicans and Democrats. It wasn't I'm going to unfriend you because you vote Republican or whatever. It was a
that's right.
different situation. It's
It
only the
was.
last 10 years that it's really gotten kind of so toxic. Um, so it was just, you just understood people had different priorities. He was concerned with financial interests and he had a lot of investments and, cash flow going on there and he was protecting that. And at that time, there were really no gay rights to protect. I mean, there
Mhm.
was no gay marriage. There was, a lot of things were different then. That wasn't a hot talking point at that time. But as a young guy moving from Florida to Dallas and going from the bottom rung of the social ladder to pretty much the top rung in the gay community in Dallas, what was the thing that really impressed you most about the way you were treated when you got to Dallas?
Well, I learned what a vicious queen was. And in Dallas, the vicious queens are exquisitely vicious. And I became a vicious queen myself. So the exquisiteness of our viciousness and our cattiness knew no bounds. I mean, knew no bounds. And I mean, I had people came up to me and would say, "Honey, you're rags to riches, and now you're a pampered poodle in Frank's penthouse." I mean, people did say some pretty ugly things to me, and it was difficult for me. It was hard. It was easy for them to hate me, and not and difficult for me not to hate myself. Honestly, I was not a psychopath, so it's not like, or a sociopath, so it's not like I just had my eye on one thing. I was a full human being with feelings and emotions, and I was getting needs met through Frank. Was I looking for daddy? Absolutely. Was I looking for the perfect father? Absolutely. Was I selfish? Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of things going on. And that's why when we were talking before we started recording, everybody in Frank's world was complicated. Frank was extraordinary, but he was extraordinarily complicated. We all were complicated. Everybody in his orbit was complicated, and it was kind of a prerequisite to being in that world is that you had issues, or you wouldn't be there. And yeah, I had a lot of shame. Yeah, I had a lot of shame, and I really tried to keep my gay bar life and my life at SMU separate. Frank and my grandmother in Queens, New York, they did treat me to study in London, to spend a summer at Oxford, SMU in Oxford, SMU in London, and then in 1985, SMU in Russia. And when I was in Russia, and Frank and I had spent a lot of time in Washington previously, we looked at the bar landscape like we did everywhere. And by the way, wherever we went in the United States, somebody knew Frank. Frank, how are you? Wherever we went, people knew Frank. It was crazy. It was so cool. And we had looked at the landscape in Washington, D.C., and of course, all the bars were closed, no windows, shut off from the world in the shadows. And he found a corner property that had just been vacated by Annie's Paramount Steakhouse. And that was a gay restaurant for all intents and purposes, although
Still
they didn't
is.
build them. Said it's still, are they still open?
Yes, they are.
My goodness, that's crazy. Well, anyway, the old man, Andy's old man, he just wanted $3,000 a month for his corner property. And the property was perfect. And it did have windows on the side of the building. And it was just like Frank liked them. Corner property, windows, good location. And so Frank, said 3,000, sure. You got a deal. And by the way, Frank was such a genius that he frequently did deals at dinner, and he'd write out the terms on the on bar napkins. And no matter how intoxicated he got, and he liked his liquor, let's be clear, he could remember the numbers the next day. It was remarkable. So he made the deal with the old man, took over the Annie's location. Annie's moved to a larger location, and and we liked Annie's a lot. The great steaks, great steaks. And so he began construction in DC. So when I got back from the Soviet Union, what was then the Soviet Union, Russia, after that study trip, Frank sat me down and he said, he said, you're studying to be a ballerina there at SMU, because I was studying theater, and he felt that it was more like being a ballerina. And he said, you're studying to be a ballerina out there. What about the business? You got to learn the business. And I'm like, yeah, I know. I've been thinking about that. And he's like, so how about you go to Washington? We're going to open in a few weeks. And you manage it. You learn the business. I'll send some people with you to train you. And you take a year off from school. Then in a year, you come back and you finish your last year at SMU, graduate, and then we'll go from there. And I agreed. I mean, I knew I needed to learn the business. And, there I was, little Lord Fauntleroy, taking all these study trips and studying at SMU. I was trying to keep my head on straight. I'd been through treatment, like I said earlier, and so on. So I agreed. I moved to Washington, D.C. Within a week or two, we opened. I learned by doing. But within that week, Frank had gone into the hospital for a minor procedure, which unfortunately, tragically exploded into a major stroke. And Frank lost his capacity. Who was there to pick everything up but Dennis? And Frank became very dependent upon Dennis. And Dennis's handpicked new number one for Frank, who was, I'll pass on my thoughts on him. And so Dennis kind of took over, and Frank was totally dependent upon him. Frank had to learn how to speak again because he was paralyzed, partially paralyzed from the stroke, and he was not himself. A flood of tears all the time, very emotional. Everything that he had kept down all those years. Every morning he'd wake up and look in the mirror. His hand might be shaking a little bit from the hangover. Say, great life, you don't weaken. He kept so much down. And after his stroke, it all came out emotionally. And perhaps him getting in touch with his emotions that way, well, he had no choice because the days of Canadian Club and cigars were out. But he was very dependent upon Dennis. I was about 6 months into my term at JR's Washington, D.C. I did learn the business. I bartended. I did the marketing. I did the ordering of the liquor. I did the management of staff. Although I had some good support, I learned all of that. I worked my butt off. I really did, and I stayed sober. It was not easy. But by 6 months into it, I kind of saw the writing on the wall, and I was like, wow, Dennis is just taking over this show. And and we were barely civil to each other, except when we had to be around Frank. So by month number 12, I saw the writing on the wall, and I resigned, and I decided to go back to school. And and Frank didn't take that well. Frank never took it well when you left the company, and especially me, his son, leaving. And I let him down. I did let him down. I did not fulfill my part of our agreement. And I do feel bad about that. And I take responsibility for that, that I did let him down. And so, anyway, I went back to school. My grandmother paid for it. Frank wasn't a part of it. And I did see Frank every now and then, but it was very awkward. It was hard to get through his gatekeepers. And but meanwhile, his bars continued to flourish. And Dennis, who had learned the business, was doing a very good job managing the bars as the general manager. Charles Armstrong, who was the manager of the bars on Cedar Springs, he got his big, what do we call it? I forget the expression, but pie from the sky. He got his deal from Frank to buy out his Houston bars. And Dennis then took over all of Dallas. I saw the writing on the wall, and I knew it was time to get out. And I finished my last year at school. And then a week before graduation, Frank passed away. And I went to the funeral, and I sat with the public. I wasn't welcome to sit with the family, which was totally understandable. And and it was a pretty painful time. Now, Frank did leave his business interests to various people. Dennis got 40%, and his sister and brother-in-law got 10% each. Niece got 10%, and a fellow named Jack Polachek got 10%. And Jack was the bean counter, meaning he counted all the money in Dallas. And he was a piece of work. He and Frank had a deal. Jack would not drink during the week, only on the weekend. And Dennis, I'm sorry, Jack and I and Charles Armstrong and I, we never had a bad word between us. We liked each other, we respected each other. But Jack, over the years, wound up buying everybody out. Either people would die and their estates just wanted the cash, he'd buy them out. And eventually he bought out Dennis's share when Dennis passed away in 1991-92. So what is so remarkable is that the bean counter wound up becoming the principal shareholder of the entire empire.
So if
And
Charlie
Frank,
Hott had stayed around, he
oh,
might have been the one
oh yeah,
holding the purse strings.
oh he might have. I mean, if he had hung around, certainly. I mean, he's unrepentant to this day, an unrepentant ex-gay. He continues to do testimonies to his congregation about the life that he led, being led in different dark directions by Frank. He says that Frank was mafia. Frank was not mafia. But yes, he definitely, but by relinquishing and selling out to Frank, he lost. He certainly would have taken over if he had stayed. And Dennis would not have had the ascent that he had. Jack would not have had the ascent that he had in that whole Game of Thrones.
So let me ask you this. If you had not resigned after that year at JR's in DC, do you think your life would have been dramatically different because of your ongoing relationship with Frank? At that point, if you had not resigned, you would have remained friends more than likely.
Oh
And
yeah,
and you might have been
right.
on the receiving end of some of that inheritance as well. You know,
Right.
things have been much different for you, do you think?
I think what would have happened is that I would have inherited JR's Washington, and I think I would have inherited a percentage of the business in Dallas. What happened was I inherited some cash, which was very generous of Frank, which in today's dollars would be, over $100,000. And he spent a lot of money on me. when we were together. I once did a calculation. It was about $250,000 that he spent 40 years ago. We know what those dollars are today.
Right.
So as Mike, the attorney, said, he said, you got yours during his lifetime. And look, if Frank had left me, if I had stayed, and if Frank had, or even if I had not stayed and Frank left me a percentage of the business, it would have killed me. I had no sense of money. I would have overdosed on life, on everything that would go with having lots of cash. I simply was not capable at that time to deal with money. He was very wise not to bequeath any percentage of the business to me. I'm entirely grateful that he didn't, because I would not have been able to handle it. I did not deserve it. I left the business of my own volition. Okay, I did not fulfill my part of the agreement, and I understand that today, and I'm responsible for that today. So no victim here. It was just how things played out, and I have been lucky that I've had other opportunities in my life to do stuff that, again, had he left me any amount of significant money, I probably wouldn't have gotten to do. So he had wisdom, and but I know that I hurt him deeply, and I wish I hadn't, and I'm so sorry.
So let me ask you this. Jack, you said Jack took over in the early 90s. Um,
Yes,
and he continued to own that until when?
I think he still owns it. And Jack is a ghost. I have never seen his picture anywhere on social media, on
Okay.
any picture. Have you ever? I mean, I've never. I mean, sometimes he was quoted in the media when Dennis died. He was quoted in the media about Dennis's passing, but he has been a ghost. He has stayed away from the spotlight.
Yeah,
But he
Mikey is
has
the face of the company now.
Mike
Uh,
Nguyen, right? Who's
yeah, Mike
Vietnamese
Quinn.
American. Yeah, and I don't
Yeah.
know if your viewers know, we're filming this. I'm in Da Nang, Vietnam. That's where I
Right. It's
live now.
tomorrow where he is. I'm talking to him from the past and he's talking to me from the future. So this is kind of
It's
an
true.
interesting situation. So when you moved to Dallas, just to kind of recap before we
But before
kind
you
of
do,
wind things down.
let's just wrap up. Let's wrap up Jack real quick.
Okay, go
So
ahead.
Jack was the principal. He bought everyone out. Now, what he did, which Frank would have loved, is he turned Caven Enterprises into a employee-owned company. So the managers had a percentage of ownership. Now, I'm sure that Jack did not give up controlling interest, but he basically gifted, who knows, 10, 20, 30, 40% of the company to the managers so that the managers would have some skin in the game and be owners in the business and therefore be responsible and hopefully not steal. And I thought that was great. And Frank would have loved it, that the managers own the business. So I think that's great, and I would love. I mean, I'd love to hear an interview with Jack Polachek, but I don't think you're ever going to get one from him. He is just a ghost. He is not seen. So that's what happened with Jack, and I have, I've gotten lots of messages from people in Dallas with through my Facebook marketing for my upcoming memoir and stuff, and he and Jack doesn't have a high favorability rating with some people, but I wasn't there. I don't know, but
Right.
he should write. He should write his memoir. And by the way, Charles Armstrong, if you're watching this, it's been 40 years. I'd love to talk to you. Charles is running the bars in Houston. Uh, but if you're watching this, Charles, please be in touch with me. So anyway, so I did interrupt you, but I just wanted to wrap up the whole Jack piece.
I appreciate
Uh,
that.
yeah,
Now, when you in the five, you basically your tight relationship with Frank in Dallas was about 5 years, 83 to 88,
yes.
before things started to go south and he passed away. So, in those 5 years in Dallas, out of all of the bars that you were exposed to that belonged to Frank Caven, what was the one that just blew your skirt up? What was the one that you said, "Oh my God, this is awesome"?
JR's. Of course, JR's. It was right up my alley. Stand and model, beautiful people. I got laid a lot at JR's. When Frank and I moved into a father-son relationship, we both were looking for number ones. And, so many men, so little time. It was JR's for sure. Now, the old plantation was a lot of fun. And every now and then, once in a blue moon, Frank would do drag. And his alter ego, his name is Rose. Rose. And when Frank wanted to, I mean, look, Frank was like a cross between Tony Soprano and Liberace. But when he was more Liberace, man, he could hold court. And when he wanted to let his hair down and let his skirt blow up high, which is one of his sayings, whatever floats your boat and floats your skirt high, he'd be Rose. Now, the old plantation burned. Uh, he and Dennis rebuilt the old plantation or renovated it in 1985. They renovated it, yes, and it burned. It was
It
not
burned on
arson.
on opening day. Before it opened, I think it was. I think
Well,
they
that
were
was
scheduled
actually
to open.
that was the old plantation with Charlie back in 1976.
Oh, okay,
Yeah, this is
that's
a
right.
further on incarnation of old plantation. Anyway, we got a call at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. We looked out the window. Of course, Frank did not have a view of downtown Dallas. He had a view of his domain, which was Oak Lawn. That was the view that we had in the apartment, and we saw the smoke billowing. It was horrible. And so we got out there on Cedar Springs, and it was just in flames. Dennis, it was his baby. The OP was his baby. He was in tears. Frank was stoic and resolute, and we all hugged, and they were determined to rebuild, and they did rebuild. And when they rebuilt, they expanded, of course, and they included a performance space, and they named it the Rose Room. And surprisingly, not many people know that was Rose was Frank's alter ego, and it was named after Frank. And lots of great careers have been launched, including Asia O'Hare, I think, from the Rose Room. So that was again, Dennis did a great job on Frank's legacy, and
I'm so glad you mentioned that because the Rose Room still exists in S4. So
okay,
their performance venue, the theater in that bar, is called the Rose Room, and it has its own distinct kind of Art Deco style logo, and it is well identified. People even say, "Oh, we're going to the Rose Room tonight," because they're going for the show. They're not going for the bar. They're going for the show. So I'm
that's
glad
right.
you mentioned that. That is something that I was aware of. That I knew it was his drag persona, and
Mm-hmm.
that it still lives on. The Rose Room is still in operation some 50 years later, right there in Oak Lawn um, on Cedar Springs.
And somewhere in the sky, Frank and Dennis are Frank smoke. Dennis is smoking his fancy French cigarettes. Frank has got his cigar, and he's got
Canadian
his
Club.
whiskey, his Canadian Club. Dennis has his Chivas Regal, and they are planning and plotting their next adventure. I know that they are. And they actually lay next to each other where Frank is buried. He and Dennis are side by side for eternity there, which I think is great as well. And but no, they're up in the sky planning their next venture together, and enjoying the Rose Room. And I like the technology that they've got in the Rose Room these days. It looks very modern and cool, but still with the Art Deco. And let's face it, social media grinder would have driven a stake through Frank's heart. Okay, because a lot of his clientele, a lot of his following, yes, they relied on JR's, Throckmorton, other places to meet people, to get laid, to have fun. And now you just swipe on your phone to meet somebody, and it would have driven a stake through his heart And I think, and I've written about this, I do write op-eds, is that that's why lots of nightclubs and bars have had to maneuver to bring in entertainment, to give people a reason to go out, okay? Because otherwise they're just going to, click on the screen to find a one night stand and not go out. So
Absolutely.
I'm glad that Frank didn't ever have to deal with social media. We had our trick cards. We all had a lot of fun. And Frank would say, "Whatever blows your skirt up, whatever blows your skirt up."
Well, I want to thank you for taking the time to tell us some of these stories about your experiences with Frank and to kind of put a spotlight on the empire of bars that he built. Just as a reminder to anybody who's listening, over the period of, I would say, roughly 20, 25 years of during Caven's lifetime when he owned bars, during that time frame, we're talking about more than 50 gay bars and a smattering of straight bars um, that he owned and operated, and many of which multiple mining companies, multiple old plantations, um, the El Goya in Tampa, multiple JRs, really made an impact on the scene. And I want to wish you all the best of luck in getting your memoir published, because I know people who have heard these names and they're like, oh, I want to hear more about, you know, the Throckmorton Mining Company or the Montrose Mining Company or the Village Mining Company or the 49th Street Mining Company or whatever. They're going to want to read your book. We're not going to sit here for 8 hours and talk about the history of Caven, but you've put a nice spotlight on it. And I wish you all the luck with the publishing of that book. And we'll be sure to promote that when it comes out so
Thank you.
people can read it. And
Thank
I
you.
also want to thank you. We'll do another episode in the not too distant future, but you also have the distinction of opening possibly the first intentionally gay themed restaurant that was called Out on Main. So you designed a restaurant from the ground up to be an explosion of gay. It was like, you know, instead of Julie Newmar, it was Liberace, um, but it was a good restaurant with good reviews for the food and service and atmosphere, but it was gay owned, gay operated, and designed for the gay community. And I want to talk about that sometime too, but we just don't have time today.
I understand, and we will. And I want to thank folks who've sent me messages, shared anecdotes of their experiences with Frank and in the bars. Please send me anything that you've got. I hear some great stories, and I've included some of them in my memoir. And yes, my memoir does go a lot deeper than what we've talked about today, but it was quite a journey. It was quite an adventure. And I think that everyone would get a kick out of it. And especially in Texas, I get so many messages from folks in Texas who really want to read it and learn about it and who've heard for years about the Caven lore. And of course, I wish Caven Enterprises and the bars all the success in the world. I'm so glad that they're still operating. I'm so glad it's partially management owned. Frank would love it. And I just love being able to talk about all this. I've done podcasts in the past, but this is the first one that's just focused on Frank and Dallas and his bars. And he was visionary. 60 bars, 60 brands. How does one do that? His vision was phenomenal. And I got to say that if Hollywood ever decides to do his story, who do we think would be a great Frank Caven? I think Kevin Spacey. I think Kevin Spacey. Honestly, I think Kevin would be perfect, and I'm not a fan. I think he'd be perfect, but we'll see where this goes and what kind of life that it has. Thank you, everybody, for listening to my stories. Art, it's a pleasure meeting you. Thank you for your advocacy for LGBT bars. As I said at the start, gay bars have been an oasis for me, and they played such an important role in the LGBT movement, LGBTQ plus movement. So thank you for your dedication and for documenting and making sure that this history is not forgotten.
Thank you.